Hey, good morning or good evening whenever you are listening. Welcome to the Hope Explained podcast. This is our second episode. I am your host, Pastor Jason Hensley, and I'm joined by my guests here. On the left, we have head pastor Rick Morris, and on our right, we have children's director Brook Price. Thank you guys for joining me.
Yes,
thanks for having us.
excited. Last week was fun.
Yeah. So this last Sunday, 2 days ago, Brooke and Rick co-taught on everybody's favorite strong, long-haired, war-waging judge of Israel. That's right. You know, we are talking about Deborah. And something that I thought was kind of funny was in preparation for the podcast, I have this stack of books. I have like 7 issues from this book called The Pastor's Gold Mine that my dad gave me. And it's just sermons and sermons and sermons. And I was scanning it to like kind of cross-reference with your sermon to find interesting things to talk about. And I kept on just, looking for Judges 4 or 5, and nothing came up. The only thing from Judges that I ever saw was, of course, about Samson, which I think is funny because Deborah's the much better example. So something ended to start us out. We know that Deborah was a judge. She was a prophetess, a wife, a mother, and a warrior. When you guys were preparing what you spoke on, or maybe in your research, what was something that stood out to you about her?
Well, I think for me, it was just, I spoke a little bit about this on Sunday, was just this sense of confidence that she seemed to have in her leadership. It's obviously God had called her to lead the people, spoke to her, gave her messages, and she just never really seemed to waver or question her ability. She never seemed to question what God was telling her to do. She just seemed to move forward with everything with this full confidence that, if God was telling her to do something, this was what she needed to do, and this is what they needed to do, and that it was all going to be good.
Yeah, with me, the main thing that stuck out with me from Deborah was like, why do we not know more about her? Like, why haven't I don't think I've ever heard a sermon on her. I'm like, why don't I know more about her? She's so incredible. The things that she did are really unparalleled. And to kind of piggyback off what Brooke said, like she was so bold. She was so confident. She was such a great leader, and she did incredible things. And I'm just like, man, why do we not know more? And why is she not a more prominent figure in the Bible?
Well, yeah, that's the ironic thing to me is when I was, you can't find many sermons about her or anything like that. But then when you look in those studies, when you actually look at what people have said about judges and the specific judges, there's a lot more about Deborah than Samson because she's the better person to emulate, right? But, I think a good way to recap what you guys said on Sunday about Deborah, or at least one of the things that makes her special, is, and if you haven't listened to what was said on Sunday, we highly recommend you go and listen to that.
Yeah.
But is to bring up what you said about Deborah, which is that she's a 5-tool player. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'm a huge sports fan, specifically baseball, big baseball fan. And as I was just reading her story, that just came to my mind. When it comes to baseball, every scout is looking for a 5-tool player, and every player wants to be a 5-tool player, but you either have it or you don't. And, the 5 tools of baseball is, you can hit with power, you have speed, you can play great defense, and you have a great arm. And there's not many of those. And everybody wants to be that, but you either have it or you don't. And scouts want that. And with Deborah, you just look at her and it's like, man, she can do everything great. Like, she's a prophet, she's a judge, she's a mother, she's a wife. And then, we didn't even get into chapter 5 really, but chapter 5, she writes poetry, she writes songs, she sings the songs. And actually, in chapter 5, that's some of the earliest Hebrew literature that we have. As far as like poetry goes, that's recorded, not just in the Bible, but in history. And so she could just do it all. She's just an incredible woman that can do everything, not just do everything, because a lot of times the more you do, you're mediocre at most things. She excelled in those areas.
Right. So then here's the question. So you said hitting for power, speed, defense, and a great arm are the 5 tools.
Yeah.
I didn't memorize that. I have it in my notes.
Great job.
Yeah, thanks.
You big sports fan.
Yeah, you know me. Yeah, I can't get enough sports. What are the 5 tools of godly leadership?
Oh, wow. I mean, of godly leadership,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, hearing from God is really big. Having the confidence to live in that purpose and that plan that God has for you. I think being able to get along with people is really, really important. The ability to communicate is really important. And then I think like faithfulness, consistency. I mean, those are all important. So,
All right.
I mean, there's a lot more, but I think those are some of the,
Sure.
just off the top of my head.
Those are the 5 tools.
Some of them.
Some of them. So, Brooke, I have a question for you. As a woman who's involved in leadership in the church, as a spiritual leader, who is a wife and a mother, and I'm going to go ahead and assume that you haven't actually led armies.
Not yet.
Not yet. Fair.
Hey,
All right.
maybe.
Hey, you never know what's in the cards. But a warrior in your own ways. What are some spots in the story of Deborah or in the character of Deborah where you looked at that and that resonated with you, or you understood it, and then what's a spot where you looked at her and you go, "Wow, that's really something to aspire to"?
Well, again, I think that that level of faith and boldness of just being willing to, when you come to a point in your life and you feel called to do something, to just have that confidence that God's going to give you the tools that you need to do them. I think that I mean, looking back on my own life, there's definitely things in my personal life, areas that I've become kind of an expert in that I never thought I would be an expert in before. And even working at a church, I have an educational background. I never saw myself as going into ministry or being on a church staff. And so when that opportunity came up, it was a big step for me, because I don't have a seminary degree. I just have a regular degree, but I didn't know if it was the right thing or if I was qualified. So it was definitely kind of a step of faith, and definitely had some encouragement from other people. But yeah, it was a big step of faith.
Then you get asked to speak on Sunday morning.
That's right.
Wow.
Yeah.
True.
Like, wow.
Well, you said you have an educational background, and we know that you're the children's director now. What were you doing right before you were the children's director then?
Right before I was the children's director, I was raising my own kids, and I was serving in. I was volunteering in a number of different areas in church. The professional background is I was a special ed teacher for San Diego Unified a very long time ago, and had stopped doing that after I had my own kids, and did tutoring and a bunch of different things kind of on the side, just to help ends meet. But kind of a smorgasbord of things. So,
Hey, all right. And how long have you been at New Hope?
I have been here almost 12 years.
Well, how about that? All right. So, the whole point of this series is to empower women, not through what any of us have to say or what the world has to say, but by reminding them of what God has to say about them through his word. And in the character of Deborah, we see a woman who's enabled to lead, to spiritual lead, to be a wife, a mother, and a warrior. But at no point is she ever constricted to one station. She does them all with flying colors. And something that you kind of alluded to at the end of your sermon was this lie that the world tells women or young girls, that they either need to be completely independent of men, or they have no independence at all. And so my question for both of you as parents of daughters is, let's say you're talking to a brand new parent of a new baby daughter. What would you tell them in concern to this lie that the world tells them? How would you combat that lie as you raise that daughter?
Well, I think whether it's a boy or a girl, but definitely, a girl, like I want just as much for my girls as I do the boys. And I want them to believe in themselves that they can be everything that God created them to be, and they can do everything God created them to do, and that they're not limited by what, barriers or lids that society or people put on them. Like, God or Deborah broke through every barrier there possibly could have been in her time. And so I just, I think, and we mentioned it on Sunday that I think it's great for women, for girls to have this mindset of, I need to be with the person that brings out the best in me, not that tries to, constrict me or hold me under their foot or whatever it is. Like, I need to be with the person that can help me flourish, that wants to bring out the best in me, that believes in me, not that, wants to limit me or keep me from using certain gifts. I think, me as a husband, like, I want to bring out the best in my wife. I don't want her to not, because she, just as I have a responsibility before the Lord to fulfill my calling, my wife has a responsibility to fulfill her calling too. And who am I to tell her what God can and cannot do through her? And so it just always amazes me, whether it's the church or whether it's spouses or whatever it might be, that we say, oh, you can't do this because of that. But, the reality is we all have a responsibility to use our gifts for the Lord. And so I just think it's important just that they aspire to, fulfill God's will in their life.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I agree. And I would add to it that, growing up, I was lucky enough, first of all, to have the example of parents that were, it was interesting. They had fairly traditional roles in our home, but I never grew up thinking that was something that they didn't both choose. And it absolutely was a partnership. It still is. And I think that back to your original question with raising girls, I have 2 adult girls, and
Both married,
yes. And I think it's great when you find your person to go through life with. And of course, I've been married 34 years, and I'm so happy that I have that person in my life. But I always wanted them to know that they were valued, and they could be independent. And as you said, they don't need another person to survive. They don't need someone else to support them and for them just to kind of get through life. It's great when you can go through life with somebody, but I wanted them to know that they were capable and strong and independent, and again, worthy of being heard and having opinions and all those things.
Yeah, you said something right there where you said, I've been holding on to it the entire time and it actually just left. You said I was going to circle it back around to Deborah. We're going to follow my thought train for a second. And it was that.
So I think with girls as well, let me just bring something else up.
Thank you.
I think too with girls, it's hard for us to really do justice the culture that Deborah was in and the society that she was in. And, we try to bring out a little bit of the context, but there's no way to contextualize the culture that she lived in, that women had 0 rights. They couldn't own land. They literally were owned by their dad or their husbands. And they had no other options. Their only option was to marry. And that's how they really were able to be supported and taken care of. Well, these days, it's different these days. But sometimes I think society still pushes the girls into that, you have to be a stay-at-home mom, or you have to be this, or you have to be that. And it's like, no, now these days you can do anything, you can be anything. And so I think Deborah's story is even more remarkable because she did what she did. Like, even if you fast forward her to our culture, we're like, wow, that's an incredible woman to do that. But back then it was unheard of. I mean, there's not another example in the Bible of what she did. It's incredible.
Well, especially when you compound that with the fact that, I mean, how great of a leader must she have been to demand such, I don't know, inspiration, respect from Barak in that moment, because he says, listen, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not going to battle without you. Right. And so that's got to be just a whole nother level of leadership on top of all the other things that she was doing.
Well, I think part of too with him is, he obviously didn't have the spiritual faith that she had, because she told him, like, she's a prophet. So she told him in those verses, like, God is going to give you the victory. Like, it's already done. Just go. He'll go before us, all that. And he's still scared, and he's like, I'll go if you go with me. And so, we say, oh, well, that was good leadership of him to, he needed her, but also like he wasn't the best leader. Like he should
Right.
have,
Yeah.
she told him God's given it to us, and he
Yeah.
still was scared to go. And,
Yeah.
and what did she tell him? Because he didn't trust.
Because he didn't trust that he was not going to get the glory for
Yes.
the victory. It was going to the leader was going to fall to the hands of a woman.
Sarah, yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of Sisera, we hear God has given your enemy into your hand, but we're also told that Sisera had 9,000 iron chariots at his disposal, and the Israelites had about zero. And if you didn't know, iron chariots are kind of like the tank of the day. If the enemy has a few chariots and you have none, you're going to have a bad time probably.
You're toast.
Yeah. So is there any hint as to, and I know most of the time it's, well, of course, God delivered, but is there any hint as to how that actually happened?
Yeah, I mean, we know what happened. There's, there's a storm. It rained really, really hard, and there's no doubt that God had caused that. And the chariots were stuck. They were inoperable. They were stuck in the mud. So they were sitting ducks for the Israelites, and so they were prepared to fight on foot. The others, other armies, they came with all their, with all their chariots and all their armor and all of that stuff, and really the advantage was completely neutralized because they were all stuck and they couldn't. That's how they were going to win the battle, fight the battles. The advantage is going to be manpower and the chariots, but when they were all stuck, it really evened the field. And of course, they were sitting ducks, and the Israelites just destroyed them.
Right. All right. Something else that you mentioned in the sermon was that ever since having had daughters, the way you read certain stories in the Bible, especially stories about women specifically, has changed or it's been informed by that experience. Out of the stories that you've talked about in the She Her series, what do you think that's most applied to?
As far as having daughters goes,
Yeah.
with the other ladies that we've studied, I think all of them. I think when you have girls I had 3 brothers, so all boys growing up, and God rocked my world when I had a girl, and then I had another girl back to back, and then, Nora has 2 girls. We have 4 girls together. So it's like, wow, like that's, it really changes your perspective on, just on the way you see girls and what they can do and what they, the abilities, and wanting them to have, God's best for them. But as far as like having girls and seeing, I think really all of them are, I see bits and pieces of all the people that we've talked about. And I think probably the biggest thing that I would really, really want for our girls is, I want them to follow God's will, which all of these girls all these ladies that we've studied have done. They listened to God, they stood up for God, and they were used by God. Like, what else could a parent want? Like, listen to God, stand up for God, be used by God. That's what I see, and that's what I want for my girls.
And I think it's just all of them are such good examples of how, we have these human expectations of, who God's going to choose for certain things. But I think they're all such good examples that he's going to choose who he's going to choose, and he has his own reasons. And it's not like he's just looking at the people who graduated the top of their class from seminary and, okay, well, they're going to be the ones that are going to, they may do some great things, but it doesn't matter where you're from, what your background is. He can use you in such powerful ways.
And Brooke, that's a great point, because really 3 of the 4 girls, Deborah might be the exception, but the other 3, they were just living ordinary, normal lives. Deborah's living a little different life because she was a judge. That's when we're introduced to her. We don't really see the background of how she got started, but the other 3 were just doing, we have midwives, and then we have just a Jewish young girl, and they're basically plucked out of obscurity to take this stand. And
and you've got to think at some point, Deborah was just a regular woman, probably married, and all of a sudden God chooses her to lead her nation and to speak to her. So there had to have been some point in her life that she was just a regular person until she wasn't.
Well, that sounds a lot like what you mentioned in the sermon, which is what was it? God doesn't call the qualified; he qualifies the chosen. And I mean that even more so speaks to exactly what you were saying, where at some point she was just another woman,
Mm-hmm.
but when God called her, she responded. And then you juxtapose that to somebody like Moses, who God called on him, told him exactly what he wanted, and even then Moses was like, "Well, I can't speak. I'm not that great of a speaker," and he contended that a few times.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that just puts more into perspective, the character of people in the Bible who respond immediately.
Mm.
So yeah, I think something that is worth visiting while we're on the topic of female leadership is female leadership in the church.
Mm.
And I think that anybody who has a church background has obviously seen this different. Some churches and denominations have a hardline stance against it.
Yeah.
Some churches simply have different verbiage between male and female leadership. What's the how do you think that breaks down? Do you think that some of that is founded? Do you think that that it might just be taking a certain interpretation a certain way? Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I mean, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
I really do, because of kind of the mindset of men is I'm in charge. I have to be in charge. I'm the leader. I'm the provider. I'm this, I'm that. And to some extent, we need more men to step up in our society. We have a lot of men they're not men anymore. They don't take care of their families. They don't provide for their families. They don't take responsibility for the choices that they make. And so we need more men to step up. No doubt about that. But as far as, women in leadership within a church, I think, it's different strokes for different folks. But I don't know how you can read the Bible, or how just not even reading the Bible. Like, how can I tell Brooke that God hasn't called her to do something, or that God hasn't gifted you with this or with that? Like, who am I to say that? And, we see throughout the Bible that even in a culture that where women had very little rights, we see them used throughout the scriptures, even on into the New Testament. Jesus, women leadership was a very prominent part of Jesus's role and Jesus' ministry, even though all the disciples were men, but they're, like the apostles, but he had others that played big roles. And even Paul with, starting the church in Philippi was with a woman. And so, I don't, it's different strokes for different folks, I think, but I think the calling is the most important thing.
Mm.
Like, I think women should have a place to fulfill their calling. And I think the local church should be a place where they're able to use their gifts. I mean, we tell people, oh, we want volunteers, use your gifts for God. We want you to use your gifts here in the church. Oh, you're a woman. Oh, you have that. Oh, no.
Right.
No, you can't use that gift. Like, who are we to say that? Yeah. I don't know. How do you feel about that, Brooke?
Yeah, very much the same. And I just, again, I don't know how you look at stories like Deborah's story and think that God can't raise up amazing female leaders. And I think, to me, again, it just goes back to, we should be looking at qualified leaders. And I don't know what difference it makes whether they're male or female, and most of the time. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there was a random point that you brought up, and that was not random, but random here, which was the idea that we need men who are decisive, and that's and I think that's the funniest foil in the story of Deborah, which is Barak, whose name means lightning. You with a name like that, you would think that you've got a real leader who's gonna take action, and then at the very end of it, you've got Jael, who did actually immediately take action. And the irony of that is, like you said, Barak had his prophet tell him exactly what was going to happen, and that still wasn't enough for him. And Jael had none of that, and she immediately took action. And so I just found that an interesting contrast there.
Yeah, I mean, he had the responsibility, but he didn't have the faith.
Right.
Like, he didn't have the, he just because he was in that, he was in a position to do what he should have done, but he didn't have the faith to take that step like those two ladies did. And really it was because of those two women that, I mean, there's a lot of other people in the battle as well, but those two women played prominent roles in Israel's victory.
Right. All right. Do you guys have anything else you'd like to talk about, or anything that has lingered in the mind?
I mean, I think for me, just Deborah's an incredible example. And if we do have reservations on leadership of women, whatever it might be, because I mean, I'll have to admit, I went to a Baptist Bible college, and so it was ingrained in me that males are the leaders, males are the leaders, males are the leaders. But when when I planted a church, and then I had daughters, and it really gets you to rethinking, okay, gosh, man, God's sending a lot of gifted ladies to our church. Why? It's my job to bring out the best in them, just like I am anybody else as a leader. And so I just think that if you're a young lady, I think you have just as much of a responsibility to seek out God's purpose and plan for your life and operate within your giftedness as everyone else. And don't let anybody tell you, don't let anybody tell you that, oh, you can't do this because you're a woman, or you can't do this because you're a girl. Well, that's not true. I mean, that's not true. We see this throughout the scriptures, some incredibly gifted ladies. And so anyways, I want to encourage any young girls or ladies out there that are in church and have gifts. I mean, be in a place where you can use those gifts.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that I would just add to that, even beyond the gender thing, is just if you feel God is leading you in a particular direction, he will give you the tools that you need to be successful in that. And, again, we were not told about what, Deborah's thought process was when, she was first called. But, at some point she certainly stepped up, and she didn't think about, well, will all the men listen to me, or will this happen? Or, she just did it, and they did listen. And so I think part of that was just a product of how it must have been so obvious that she was God's chosen person, for one thing. And I think part of it is I have to think that he helped make the way for her too, in the hearts of the people. So again, I think that regardless of your gender, if you're feeling called by God to do something, he's going to give you the tools to do it.
Well, and we can wrap up this podcast with this right here. I mean, we know this, that before Deborah, God's people were enslaved, they were defeated. And at the end of chapter 5, under Deborah's leadership, chapter 5 ends with 40 years of peace with the Israelites under her leadership. So you tell me.
Right.
I mean,
yeah, no, that doesn't happen by accident.
Not at all.
Yeah.
No. Well, Rick, Brooke, thank you guys for joining me here today.
Yes, so fun.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Subscribe.
Yes,
listen.
subscribe. Yes. This is our very second episode. So if
our
you
very
would like,
second,
very
Very
second,
second.
not our very first, our
no,
very second.
it is the very second. If you guys would like to subscribe, we would appreciate that on whatever platform you're listening to. And if you are in the Chula Vista area, or you live in Chula Vista, we would love to invite you to church here at New Hope East Lake Church. Our address is 2720 Olympia Parkway Drive. But other than that, thank you guys again, and hope you have a great day.